What we do know about archaeology is there is simply nothing about Moses or an exodus of a people out of Egypt from archaeological data. It became clear that there is not just no mention, but the slightest hint of any knowledge of the Pentateuch in general, not just Moses and the Exodus, but the Pentateuch or the Bible anywhere before the 4th century, the end of the 4th century BCE.
What you're saying is there's nothing in Babylon, Judea, and Elephantine that signals or gives any hint, no whiff of awareness of what we see in the Pentateuch. How significant is that? Is this just an argument from silence, or should we have expectations of something?
You know, the argument from silence, the silence is so definite when you combine the Persian period and the early Hellenistic period, which is the period we're talking about. There's about 5,000 sources. In Samaria, we have the Wadi Dalia papyri, which are very important. And it is absolutely clear that he did not know of a Moses. Because if Moses was there, clearly the church fathers will have mentioned it. Okay, that's absolute certainty that this would not have been gone down in silence.
Give me the scientific external data that anchors the concept you're pointing at that proves this must have a date in the 7th century, 6th century BCE, pre-exile.
Again, there is simply no evidence outside the Bible for any knowledge of the Bible before the end of the 4th century. Before that, nothing. There is no personal name Judah anywhere, for example. That is the one that you would expect. They come from Judea, right? So, you would expect something like that. Nothing. No Moses, no Aaron. As I said, no biblical hero.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. We're dealing with Moses. Moses is not only the central figure of Judaism. Everyone loves the movie 10 Commandments. We also want to know more about who is this person? When does he really show up in history? So I have an expert joining us, and that is Dr. Gad Barnea. He knows a thing about Moses and the Hebrew Bible. Welcome back to Myth Vision, my friend.
Pleasure to be here, buddy.
This is going to be an exciting, deep video. It might actually be quite shocking for some of them who have never actually considered in a scientific way of what the evidence seems to suggest about Moses. When this character, if I can call him that, appears in history. And I kind of wanted to throw it at you and allow you to take us wherever you have planned, because it's a deep dive, and everyone's going to want to stay tuned to the end to really understand how you're drawing your conclusion. So to tease people, it is your personal research that has led you to say Moses seems to be a very late character in history, according to what the standard scholarly idea about when this character existed is, if I'm not mistaken.
A number of things. I'll provide two kind of layers of context, scholarly and popular. In discussions about the Exodus and about Moses, of course, these are two connected stories, right? The story of Moses and the story of the Exodus. In the discussions, we often look at, did the Exodus happen, right? That's a very famous question. Is it an actual historical event? And of course, is Moses historical? And usually we look at archaeology, which is fine. The methodology for to look at archaeology is fine methodologically, but it's an argument. Ultimately, it's an argument from silence, because what we do know about archaeology is there is simply nothing about Moses or an exodus of a people out of Egypt from archaeological data. Even though it's an argument from silence, it's a pretty strong argument from silence, because, of course, the Egyptians kept meticulous records. You would expect it, but again, technically, it could be somehow have passed under the radar, an event like that. So under the archaeological radar. Of course, then there's the Bible, an analysis of the texts that deal with Moses, of the different layers of redaction and addition, which are there, of course, in the story of the Exodus. But that also is not in terms of historical relevance, that also is very inconclusive. So we don't know, we can't say, well, because of these layers of redaction, in addition to the story, that does not prove or disprove the historicity of the Exodus or Moses. So this argument has been going on now for, well over a century or more. And it's in scholarly circles, it's pretty strong that there is no, the Exodus and the person of Moses as described in the Bible is probably not historical, but a lot of scholars say, well, but it might have a grain of truth in it. There might be something that it is based on, and it might be closer to the biblical version or more remote. So we're trying to find some anchor, some historical anchor. And so I'm trying to approach this from a different perspective. And I kind of started looking into this because of my studies on the Elephantine community. Ultimately, over time, it became clear to me and to other scholars, contemporary scholars that we kind of work with and exchange ideas, like Professor Jonathan Adler who's my friend, and I think you've had him as well on your podcast. And so it became clear that there is not just no mention, but the slightest hint of any knowledge of the Pentateuch in general, not just Moses and the Exodus, but the Pentateuch or the Bible anywhere before the 4th century, the end of the 4th century BCE.
May I jump in here? Because I really feel this dialogue is needed from a layperson like me who researches this stuff, because I represent the viewer. And that's my goal in this discussion. It's important that we emphasize you're saying something here. What you're saying right here, I want to highlight and pause for one moment, because people go, that's an argument from silence, or they come up with what I would say are, I'm not saying excuses, I want to call them that, but like I hear these things that just they don't like green lights go off in my head and I go, oh, light bulb, oh, solve the problem. That is, a small group of priests for centuries had this material, but they were fringe, they weren't important, they were insignificant. What you're saying is there's nothing in Babylon, Judea, and Elephantine that signals or gives any hint, no whiff of awareness of what we see in the Pentateuch. How significant is that? Is this just an argument from silence, or should we have expectations of something, Gad?
Absolutely. So, yeah, that's a great question. The argument from silence, the silence is so deafening that even in places where you would expect. So, for example, the folks at Elephantine, and not just in Elephantine, so in Babylonia, Elephantine, in Palestine at the time, we have zero evidence of any knowledge of the Pentateuch or any knowledge of the laws of the Pentateuch. And when I say, we have good sources, we have thousands of sources from that period. When you combine the Persian period and the early Hellenistic period, which is the period we're talking about, there's about 5,000 sources, okay, roughly speaking. So we have a lot from Jewish, relevant to the Jewish, either from Jewish or about Jewish customs, and in none of them, before the final phase of the 4th century BC, and even later, it's not huge, but it begins about at that time. In none of them do we find any knowledge, any hint to any knowledge of the Pentateuch or the Bible in general. Now, we would expect that for example, in legal context, which we have a lot. We have hundreds of legal documents, actually thousands of legal documents across the entire region, and we would expect something like by 2 or 3 witnesses is something is established. This legal idea that is so prominent in later Judaism and even in the New Testament, right? So by 2 or 3 witnesses, we don't find anything like that in any of the contracts, even among Jews. Contracts where Jews make contracts with other Jews, and where the administrator of the contract is a Jewish person as well. So even if it's a 100% purely Jewish context, you don't find that. Okay, anywhere. So that's just one example. Another example is at Elephantine, and the viewers might not know this. They had a temple. They had a fully functioning temple with sacrifices, but not exactly the sacrifices. Not the full set of sacrifices that we know from the Pentateuch. And it had other other things in it that are really do not correspond to what we would expect from a Jewish temple, let's say, at the time. The word Jewish, I'm just going to say that very quickly, is anachronistic at this point. So, but I will use it just for the sake of clarity or convenience. So they did not have that, but the temple was destroyed in 410 BCE, and then they write to Jerusalem, to the high priest and to the governor of Jerusalem. But they never, these are Jewish people in Egypt, okay, on the Nile. It's an island on the Nile facing Aswan, being persecuted by Egyptians. Okay, the temple was destroyed by the Egyptians, so they are persecuted in Egypt. This would be a perfect place to inject to put something that is related to the story of the Exodus, right, or something that is related to different experiences of Jewish people in Egypt, but nothing. They don't. They mention nothing of the sort. Again, it's an argument from silence, but you would really expect that, and it would certainly strengthen their argument, right?
So the red flags for me have been the many different gods, the archaeology, Jonathan Adler, and you're well aware of dietary, not dietary restriction. There's no restriction. They're eating whatever they can, whatever region. And these are red flags as well that combine with what you're saying, and they scream louder than the silence to me that it's not just that lacking, they're clearly not aware of any of it, which means where is it? And I get into trouble, Gad, with my scholarly friends who are like, what? No, there is pre-Babylonian, pre-exilic material here with Moses and these characters and these laws, and Josiah's reforms really happen, and the people. And Josiah's reforms describe all the people of Israel at that moment somehow practicing the law. And that means they know about it. Well, why is it the evidence that is more solid and better easily interpreted to give us some clues doesn't show these guys, Moses and Abraham, and doesn't show these laws? It doesn't show those practices, yet we're supposed to just trust the scholars who have this historiographical layering kind of dating, assuming earlier material, when we have none of that material from that period. We only have this material later that's supposed to guess. It's a head scratcher for me.
Right. If you dating any biblical text is almost never possible if you rely only on the Bible in order to relate to date that text. So, for example, if you say yes, let's say Jeremiah quoted or referred to Genesis or to the story of creation somehow, that means that it was known in the 6th century, let's say BCE. You're relying on interbiblical references, right? You don't have an extra biblical anchor, and that is circular because we know that the Bible was continuously edited, or at least went through several cycles of edition and redaction. Even Jeremiah itself. So the book of Jeremiah, you have the longer version, the shorter version in the Greek Jeremiah, and you have an intermediary version that is a little bit longer than the Greek, but not as long as the Masoretic text that we have in Qumran. And then you have the Masoretic text that is longer. And it looks almost certain. I would say it's 100% certain that the Masoretic text reflects a later tradition. So the book of Jeremiah continued to be edited, and people continued working on the book of Jeremiah, throughout for centuries, really, for a long time. And so at any point during that time, one could have added this reference to Genesis, right? And could have added it very easily. We know that they even had no problem changing a single word, not just an entire passage or an entire pericope, or chapters did not exist, of course, in antiquity, or a paragraph or even a verse, but they were able to. Sometimes they only changed one word, and we do have that absolutely documented. In the Hasmonean period, okay, they would go in and surgically change a word for ideological reasons. Yeah, so at any point in time, we need to, as scholars, we need to always be very, very, very critical of that text, critical in the sense of being very scientific about it, and not just taking it at face value and saying, is this really necessarily to be dated to a later period, or could it have been added later on? And to look for clues, also textual clues within the text, and if possible, extra biblical clues.
One more question, just
Sure.
because I know we're getting to Moses. And for those, please forgive us for not getting there sooner. Gad has told me for a long time, we really have to unravel this. This is something that is very meticulous. And it's important to point out, what do you do as someone who points out we really should anchor this outside of the Bible? When someone who tries to bring in archaic language like Song of the Sea, Song of Deborah, these kind of arguments, and then suggest, therefore, they must be ancient, and all we have are the Song of the Sea or the Song of Deborah. We do have the Balaam inscription, which is another thing, but in that, it's radically different, polytheistic compared to what we see in the Bible, which is Yahwistic centric. Like, what do we do with this ancient language game when we know later authors are archaizing materials? And we have to pretend they are ignorant. I know you've written on this in terms of anchoring something way back here in the 8th century, but like, I guess what I'm getting at is like, are we supposed to suspect 3rd and 2nd century scribes were not intelligent enough to archaize ancient language? And would they have intentionally known how and purposely done that? I don't know. I mean,
well, their Greek neighbors did. So the Greeks did that. The Greek did archaize their language in order to harmonize Homer and things like that. They would do that. Clearly, archaizing was something that people did. I mean, it's not like the Jewish people invented this form of organizing texts. So archaizing is certainly something that was done not just in literary texts, but also on coins. If you look at Hasmonean coins, the script is what's called Paleo-Hebrew, or the script on the coins is ancient. It's archaizing. Even the script on the coin is archaizing itself. People did not write like that in the second and 1st century BCE anymore, but they use that in order to show that, look, we are traditional. We come from a traditional background. We are reestablishing the Israel of old, or the Judah of old. The older kingdoms, and so the archaizing was even down to propaganda, in the coins themselves. So definitely, archaizing was something that everyone did. It was part of what people did in general, for not just for propaganda, but even for just connecting to their identity, or an imagined identity that they had. So that's definitely not surprising, and we should always expect that as at least an option in our research to say, okay, how can we show that this is archaizing or not? So there are different ways to evaluate that, if at all. I mean, sometimes you just simply cannot know. But language in general, whether it's archaizing or not, is something I never date by language. Okay, I never date a text just using the language in any of the languages that I work with. I work a lot with Aramaic, with Egyptian languages, and with Persian languages. I don't do it though in Persian languages and in Iranian languages and in Egyptian languages. We have a ton of material, okay, from all periods, especially in Egyptian, of course, much more than in Iranian. In Hebrew, we have nothing. Almost nothing. We have very little long texts. Most of the texts that we have in Hebrew from the Iron Age and the Persian period in Hebrew and Hellenistic, most of this are bulle, things like that, small text with names and very short text that don't give you any idea of what the grammar was. We have very few. I mean, less than 10, really, actually, of any actual interesting length that is good enough to provide any kind of glimpse into the language at the time. But even in Egyptian, it's very tricky, because it could be just a dialectical difference. It does not necessarily have to be a temporal difference, right? A chronological. Right. It could be a dialectical difference. So how do you know that this is not simply a text that was written in the northern kingdom, let's say in Samaria, and not in Judah? And they had definitely had dialectical differences. Dialectical differences exist in Egypt and in Palestine today. Not just then. And today it's less so, because you have, communications, open communications, people communicate across great distances. But at that time, people rarely ventured outside their village. So dialectical differences were very strong. Methodologically, dating by language is very problematic. Sometimes it can be done, but it's really, I avoid that. I simply avoid that.
So how do we anchor it? And then maybe we lead into I did a documentary recently that talks about Moses being a later invention, probably Hellenistic. It got me in a little bit of trouble with some of my scholar friends, again, as I've hinted at.
Right.
But you have drawn, under your own analysis and your own research, that Moses seems to be a later character, at least based on the evidence. It's as solid as you can get with what we have until somehow evidence comes forward that we don't have. This is the best we can. So how do we anchor it? And you've hinted at it outside of the Bible, but maybe give us a tease and leading into this amazing information you discovered about Moses that we can dive deep in.
So we talked about the Pentateuch and about how there's absolutely no hint whatsoever to any kind of knowledge of the Pentateuch up until the late 4th century. Even in the mid 4th century, in Samaria, we have the Wadi Dalia papyri, which are very important papyri. We don't have a lot, as I said, we just don't have a lot of documentation from the southern Levant, and this is one of the more important 37 papyri that record transactions between Jews selling Jewish slaves to one another. So that goes squarely against, of course, the Pentateuch about selling a Jewish slave, right? So they clearly go against that, or simply don't know about it. And we should, I think, put it in, since we have a complete silence anywhere else. Mid 4th century, clearly people are not knowledgeable about the Pentateuch or about the laws of the Pentateuch, because again, these are contracts that are done in front of the governor. I mean, this is not just between two people in private. These are serious transactions done in front of the governor. Clearly, selling a Hebrew slave was not a problem in the law of the land at the time. So that's mid 4th century. 4th century, again, later 4th century, nothing in the primary sources, but we do have kind of the cutoff between the turn of the century, between the 4th and the 3rd century. We are starting to see in Greek sources people start to write about a person called Moses, and so that is the first step we should look at. Now, not only Moses, but we start seeing in the onomastikon, meaning in the list of names, in the names that we find in these ancient documents, we start seeing names that are recognizable from the Bible as well. So also showing some knowledge with literary heroes from biblical sources. Okay, we don't see that at any time. So names, again, we have, as I said, thousands of documents. Names in the onomastikon before the end of the 4th century, we have no names no Moses, no Aaron, none of the 12 tribes, no Judah, even as a personal name, no Levi, none of these 12 tribes, none of the matriarchs, no Sarah, no Leah, none of these, Rachel, okay? None of these names that are so important as heroes of the narrative of the Pentateuch appear before the beginning of the 3rd century, and even then they're not extremely popular. Okay. Now, at the time, literary heroes in other cultures were very popular. To name your child after a literary hero, that it was done in the Iranian sphere, it was done in Mesopotamia by the Greeks as well, from Homer's works and others. So naming a child after a literary hero was something that was done. And I could argue as well that it was done also by the Jews in Babylonia for Achikar. Now, Achikar, as your viewers might know, was the first really international bestseller, and it was an extremely popular book about this person called Achikar, and it had a list of wisdom sayings and also a narrative. And these two were clearly composed independently, but it was a very, very popular story and a very popular literary document, and it is found also at Elephantine.
Is this the same Ahikar that I'm trying to make sure maybe you recall? There's some golden chalice that plays a part in this narrative, and I've heard some scholars, I like digging up like scholars that people don't know about who've written on stuff about this, that the Joseph narrative may actually nod to awareness of this story, because when Joseph, in disguise, incognito, puts the golden chalice and acts like his brother stole it, Well, in the Ahikar story, he's like accused of death. Like they're going to punish him for death, from what I understand.
But that was a very, very, very popular story in the Achaemenid period. As I said, it was even found at Elephantine, so they did not probably did not conserve a copy of anything biblical, but they did have this. So they had no problem. Of course, they had nothing against literature, but they did not have any Jewish literature per se. We do see in Babylonia at the time suddenly appearing quite a lot of people in contracts, names that we find in contracts that are named Achikar. So it seems like they were named after this literary hero, as was the case, as I said, in the Iranian sphere at the time, and by the Greeks and others. So
we're dealing with 5th century, approximately, give or take 5th, 4th century BCE, correct, in Babylon, in Palestine, and Egypt. This is the region.
Right. Okay. That's right. So I'm just setting the stage here to show just how deafening the silence is, all-encompassing. We need to understand just how deep that silence goes. Every aspect you look at, everywhere you go, everything you touch at that time, there's simply no knowledge of the Bible, no knowledge of the Pentateuch, no knowledge of Moses, of Exodus, or anything like that until we reach the 4th century. Now, one of the a possible terminus antequem, so the earliest date possible, or the date before which we can kind of have a historical cutoff, is with Theophrastus. Theophrastus was the successor of Aristotle in Athens. He inherited the school of Athens. Was very close with Alexander III, or Alexander the Great, and with Ptolemy. Ptolemy and Alexander grew up together. They both studied together in the academy, in Aristotle's academy. So Theophrastus was the one who inherited that, and also was according to some sources, kind of was the inspiration behind the famous Library of Alexandria. Although we have no proof that he ever was in Alexandria. He probably stayed in Athens, but he inherited Aristotle's library and provided the vision for a library in Alexandria. Now, he was an extremely prolific writer, and he wrote, as a philosopher, he wrote pretty much about all aspects of life that the Greeks at the time were interested in. And one of this was laws and lawgivers, not just by Greeks, but also by barbarians or non-Greeks. And he wrote a 3-volume book on laws. We don't have it. We don't have the full version of it today, but it is quoted by later historians, by the church fathers and others. Now, in this, he basically is trying to provide a full list of the biggest names of the most important lawgivers in history at that time, and it is absolutely clear that he did not know of a Moses. Okay, again, this is second half of the 4th century BCE. So Moses is not there. And how do we know that Moses is not there, even though we don't have the full 3-volume work? Because if Moses was there, clearly the church fathers will have mentioned it. Okay, that's absolute certainty that this would not have been gone down in silence. They would have quoted him as they quoted him on anything that is related to to what they're interested in, which is ultimately the Hebrew Bible.
Wouldn't Josephus quote him as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And so they had access to these works, and they did not quote it. So clearly, Moses was not part of was not seen at the time. Again, this was the kind of the leading philosopher at the time, was not seen as a lawgiver or one of the main lawgivers of the time. So we can use that as kind of a cutoff date to see, well, okay, clearly before the time of Theophrastus, again, mid-4th century BCE to the end, really, of the 4th century, roughly, there is, at least in the greater Greek world, they've never heard of a Moses as a lawgiver. The next and really, really important source, and we have a number of sources that appear around the same time, Hecataeus of Adbera, which did work in Alexandria. He's from Adbera, but he worked in Alexandria, and he rose to fame in Alexandria, and he did most of his writing there. And Manetho. So they are writing around the same time about they know about a person called Moses. They don't necessarily know about the biblical version of Moses, but they know about a Moses. Okay. They not only know about a Moses, but they know about an Exodus, but not the Exodus that we know from the Bible. Okay. So this is pretty significant. They know about a person, an important person called Moses, and they know about him being a leader of the Jewish people, and they know about him bringing the Jewish people, but not around in Sinai and all of that. He goes out or kicked out of Egypt or comes out of Egypt. Different versions exist in order to build Jerusalem as a polis builder. Okay. And in fact, he is mentioned alongside other polis builders. He's literally mentioned alongside other polis builders. So they clearly, that's a name coming from Alexandria of this mythical person who is a polis builder for the Jews, just like Cadmus was a polis builder for Boeotia and others. So you had this polis builder character that is such a Hellenistic concept, such an important Hellenistic concept of a person that is, and in the Hellenistic sphere, usually in Cadmus and others, these are people who are tied in one way or another to the Phoenicians. So they are coming from the east to create from a more ancient land to establish this polis, this major city in some area. By the way, also the Romans later on, the Romans kind of recruited Aeneas from Homer, one of the Trojan heroes, or the heroes of the Battle of Troy, and they recruited that character to be the founder of the Roman race as well. The one who, so this idea of someone coming from the east or coming from the ancient world and establishing a city, a polis, in a deserted area, and they do call Judea a desolate area. Even in the late 4th century or early 3rd century BCE, they specifically say that Judea was desolate and that they came and built the temple and built Jerusalem. Okay, of course that's not the biblical story, right?
Yeah, this makes me think of Plato, by the way. Like the Jewish people are looking to the models of polis lawgiver founders. And here's a perfect example that maybe they start crafting their own, just the way that we witness Rome use Aeneas. I mean, it's not like we have to guess. They intentionally use a mythical character from an ancient war. And it makes me wonder, like, is Moses... Are they pulling from an ancient? Maybe we're jumping to conclusions here. Maybe you have a guess on this, but like, are they looking at ancient Egyptian pharaohs? Are they looking at ancient Egyptian Hyksos stuff and then saying, "Hey, we're going to try and like insert our history way back here by just picking a character where we're only picking the name Moses"? I don't know, but it makes me think they had no nations, no people groups had a problem with pulling a mythical hero as a founding lawgiver, polis builder.
Right. It's not. You're right. It's not just that they didn't have a problem. That was something that they were proud of. And that was something that they did in order to show how ancient they are and how, how Hellenistic they are, even how much of a good citizen they are of the Hellenistic world. And it's not only that they didn't have a problem with it. That's something that they actually put up front. They were very proud. That's something you would be proud of as a citizen of the Hellenistic world. As I said, even Rome did that. That these are the Enneads that Virgil wrote, and the Enneads are about the same length as the Pentateuch in terms of the number of verses and words. So the Enneads are, and that was one person writing for 10 years, wrote the equivalent of a Pentateuch, except he wrote it in meter and in rhyme. And the Pentateuch did not have to do that. So you can even write much more quickly if you don't have to do that. He was commissioned by the emperor, by Augustus, to do that. So it's not only that they didn't have a problem, that is something that they wanted to establish and to promote. And they were very, very, very proud of having this type of tradition that is built into the model of a Hellenistic polis builder and ethnogenesis.
Real quick, before we move to your next source, I'm curious to know, I don't know if there's anything in history that we're aware of, but do you think someone commissioned, I mean, I know they commissioned a translation, but I'm kind of being a little bit pushy here to think, is there a commissioning of this kind of inventive nature of the history of the Jews that we have anywhere hinted in your view, like that there's someone behind, let's write this. We need a national identity that roots back into tradition, and we need to have this written.
Well, of course, I mean, not directly, but the pseudo letter of Aristeas, or the letter of pseudo Aristeas, 2nd century BCE. Some put it in the late 3rd century, but I think it's more 2nd century, early 2nd century BCE. That document, the letter of Aristeas, tries to show how Ptolemy commissioned 72 sages of Jewish sages to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. What it does show, at least, is that, or at least what it tries to show, is that there was some commissioning done by Ptolemy to preserve Jewish tradition. Now, in Alexandria, maybe kind of a segue into Alexandria at the time is due, because Alexandria in the early 3rd or throughout the 3rd century BCE and the late, or even before that, in the late 4th, but certainly in the 3rd, was the most futuristic city that the world has seen. Okay, it had this museum attached to the palace of Ptolemy, which was a large complex. The museum was simply the place of the muses, and within that museum, there was the famous Library of Alexandria that continued to function for centuries later. And so that was a major center of scholarship at the time. Often people say, well, the library, if you read a book, several books, I mean, not all of them, but some books about the Library of Alexandria, they say, well, Alexandria was not the first library in the world. There were other libraries in Nineveh or in the Library of Ashurbanipal and other libraries in the ancient world. That's not exactly true. There were archives in the ancient world. So places where you just put for storage, you would put an ancient document in case you would need it for administrative reasons, or just to keep tabs on certain events and certain commitments. And it was used as a center for scribal training. But the difference between those libraries or archives and the Alexandria Library is that the Alexandria Library was built according to the vision of Aristo and Theophrastus, as we mentioned, and was a center of critical learning of texts. It wasn't about just storing data or storing documents. It wasn't just about training scribes. People spent, from the beginning, people just looked at the different sources. They really focused on the Greek world, they didn't care about other sources at that time, but they looked at the Greek sources. So of course Homer and others, and Hesiod, and they looked at these sources, and of course the Plato and the pre-Socratic philosophers. They looked at these sources and they found different manuscripts that are not necessarily agreeing with one another, and they tried to harmonize it. They created texts that mimic these other texts. And basically what they did is they followed the same type of redactional and editorial process that we actually see also applied to the Bible. Okay, redactions, harmonizations, amplifications, adding words here and there to make it more, to make different areas, different parts of the text correspond better to one another, resolving conflicts in the text and things like that. So we see that already applied in Alexandria to the Homeric corpus and to the general Hellenistic corpus at the time. In Alexandria, so again, you would go to Alexandria in the ancient world. They had it. The city was created as a grid. It was designed as a grid, which was an innovation at the time. It was not the first, but it was more systematic. And the major temple there would have doors that would open automatically, and you light a fire for the sacrifice. So it looks like you're offering a sacrifice, and the doors accept it. It opens automatically by a very, very interesting and sophisticated kind of hydraulic and temperature guided, temperature driven system that they built. So it was truly futuristic. It was something that people never saw before. So that's the spirit of Alexandria at the time, and it drew to it everyone who wanted to be something in the Hellenistic world.
Just to clarify, as you pointed out, the redactional, the harmonizers, the scribal kind of spirit environment in which they're working as scholars. Is it plausible, not just possible, but I know anything's possible, but like, is it plausible to suggest that what we see as layers and redactions in the Bible did not demand hundreds of year gaps between each of these layers, but rather could have all taken place during
Absolutely. Yep.
scribal inventions during this period?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what they did with the Hellenistic sources. So those did not take hundreds of years. That's what they did. That was part of the vision of the Alexandria Library, of how you work there on these texts. So these are texts, again, this is the first library in the more modern sense of the word, which is a place of study, and not just a place of archiving documents and training scribes. And so, yeah, absolutely. This is what was done in Alexandria. And I think there's very little doubt can be, one can have very little doubt that these same techniques that were developed in Alexandria were also applied to the Hebrew Bible. I have a book that I'm working on that the kind of the working title for it is Under the Ptolemaic Sun, because there's nothing new under the sun, right? But there was then under Ptolemy. And this book, I show all of the arguments from silence that we talked about earlier, but I also show how the Greeks worked in Alexandria, how they did their editorial work and the redaction, the work of redaction and harmonization and resolving conflicts between different manuscripts and different versions of the text. So what they did from the sources that we have, and how these also apply to the Hebrew Bible. So absolutely, it does not take a lot of time to do necessarily. Once you get the idea and once you get the vision, it does not require centuries.
This is what, like, this, by the way, is a shocking, observation for Deuteronomistic history. There's just so many, I almost want to say, models that have been around for quite some time, for a century and a half, that this isn't debunking that there is these kind of redactional layers potentially happening here and whatnot, but it's saying, hey, your ideas of it having to be anchored way back here, just push this stuff later. And then it try to explain why a scribe chose that rather than this, instead of trying to act like, well, that reflects hundreds of years earlier ideas. How do you know that? How can you prove that? Give me the scientific external data that anchors the concept you're pointing at, that proves this must have a date in the 7th century, 6th century BCE, pre-exile, in order to do that. Could they not have these visions or these ideas, that thought, in the Hellenistic period, and are romanticizing about the past? So I just, there's so many questions I have. I just need give me the evidence, right? That's where my mind is. But
Right. So what you just said, basically, that's not a question for me. You're talking about scholars, if I understand correctly, other scholars that do claim that it is maybe 7th or 8th century or 6th century,
right? They want
BCE. So this was a question that directed to them, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
But yeah. So I mean, again, there is simply no evidence outside the Bible for any knowledge of the Bible before the end of the 4th century. Once Alexandria, which again, keep in mind, the Jews at the time were under the direct control of the Ptolemaic Empire. Okay, so it wasn't, Alexandria was not a different. It was the same administrative context as Jerusalem or Samaria. Okay, it's not like they have to to go anywhere to get these ideas, to get exposed to these ideas. Also, we know that a pretty large portion of the population in early Alexandria, when it was established, was already, the Jews were there, and they were quite a lot of them. Some estimates say that even about 1 million Jews were already there at the time. So yeah, because Alexander, according to several sources, Alexander took mercenaries both from Samaria and from Judah when he went into Egypt. I think a million is an exaggeration, but in any case, there was a lot. There was, several, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of Jews at the time in Alexandria. So there was a substantial Jewish presence at the time when these things were developed, and obviously they would be attracted to this, like anyone else there in the Hellenistic world, to the innovations of the library in Alexandria. I mean, this was like the Silicon Valley of antiquity. That's where you would go in order to get exposed to into the latest and greatest innovations, the latest knowledge, the latest discoveries. And if you wanted to be to be someone, you would have to know this and to have some good knowledge of what's going on in the library and in the latest and greatest inventions and visions there. So yeah, they were clearly involved in this, and would not be surprising if they say, well, look, all the Hellenistic folks in Alexandria, the Hellenistic scholars in Alexandria are only doing Hellenistic work. They're working on their own sources. We are going to now establish something similar for our sources. Now, I'm not saying that there were no sources before the early 3rd century, no Jewish sources, literary sources. I'm sure, and I have an article, I have one article that I have on a Jewish source from the late 8th and 7th century BCE is about the oracles to the nations in the book of Amos, and I can date them very, very relatively precisely to the, I mean, even I show that there are 2 layers, but to the end of the 8th century, beginning of the 7th, and I can do that because I have extra biblical data that I can point to, and so clearly there was something in the Jewish collection of sources that is older than the 4th century. I'm not saying everything came ex nihilo out of the Hellenistic period. There were clearly older sources. We don't necessarily know which ones these necessarily are, and really I don't think one can date these sources unless we have an actual anchor, extra biblical anchor. So clearly a lot of work on the enterprise of creating a Bible, or at the time, I mean, when we think as modern people today about the Bible, we think about it as a sacred text. It was not seen as sacred, and the proof of course is that they had no problem continuing to modify it. Okay, a sacred text, you leave it fossilized, or more or less fossilized. But if it's sacred, right, because that's you believe that that's the way God transmitted it, so you don't dare touch it. But they saw it as a authoritative text, not necessarily sacred. Right. And even then, it was authoritative in different levels, and it evolved up until when it reached the Hasmonean period, so mid 2nd century BCE, where you actually have the Hasmoneans promulgating and promoting a version of the Bible, which is a proto-Masoretic / Masoretic version of the Bible that was then promoted, and we start seeing, as Jonathan Adler showed very, 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 very convincingly, we start seeing people in practice following the precepts of the Pentateuch. So these things evolved from the beginning of the 3rd century to the middle of the 2nd century, and really continued to evolve even later, while the Bible was still being developed, and the biblical text that we know continued to be developed into the Common Era, not just the late centuries of the BCE period. The thing is, it's a very, very complex picture.
So now we're at okay. First thing, let's recap. We've got names. People are naming their people after heroes in the famous literature. Ahiman.
Ahiman is a different thing. Yeah, Ahikar.
Totally different name, because I just wrote about that yesterday, so I got confused. But like Ahikar, is showing up in names. You also have theophoric names that are connected to Yahweh, which is their God. But there's no Moses. There's no Jacob. There's none of these names.
None of these. End of the 4th century, we start seeing Joseph, Yehoseph, or really, we start seeing Joseph written in a later format, and I'll explain. So we start seeing Yehoseph, we start seeing Simeon, okay, and Simon. A few names that are kind of heroes, biblical heroes, start popping up only late 4th century and into the 3rd. Before that, nothing. There is no personal name Judah anywhere, for example. That is the one that you would expect. They come from Judea, right? So, you would expect something like that. Nothing, no Moses, no Aaron. As I said, no biblical hero. Name of a biblical hero from the
and argues something about Abraham when he was arguing about the name Abraham. And there's forms of ABRM in places like
in the second millennium BCE,
right,
in Mesopotamia, not in our area. But you're right. So there are names Abram in those areas. Even Jacob, even Jacob also in the second millennium. But not necessarily in Yahwistic or /Jewish contexts. But those were names that existed in the second millennium BCE, but they don't show up in a Jewish context ever. Okay?
Right. Or Moses is partly Egyptian, even though it's kind of like a weird, it's not like a full name. It doesn't seem to make that much sense. People are at least scratching their head confused. Maybe you can address
And in fact, Thomas Schneider, a very famous Egyptologist, just published a few years ago an article, a very good article about how he believes that it cannot be an Egyptian name, Moses. So, and he's, that's what he does. He's an Egyptologist, but he basically claims that that it cannot be. Although name the Mosh, or element of the name. So we have Ach Moshe, for example, and names of pharaohs that contain this element in their name. That particular element, as a name apart, as a name in its own right, is very rare. It does exist in the Egyptian onomasticon. We do have rarely people who are called only by that element. Very rare, but it does exist. So I can't say that it's necessarily not Egyptian.
Okay.
But it could be. It doesn't necessarily have to be Egyptian. It could be other. It could come from other traditions as well.
Like we talked about Musaeus, but that's the jumping.
We will get to that. I assume.
I just wanted to recap. We're at Hecataeus of Abdera. We are in the 3rd century, early 3rd century, mid 3rd century BCE. We've left the 4th century. So here we are.
Hecataeus is on the cusp between the 4th and the 3rd, right? So that's early. Actual writing, we're probably talking about very early 3rd.
Got it. Now we're moving into another, or are we going to be emphasizing what Hecataeus?
Well, a little bit about Hecataeus. So he's presenting a different type of exodus. We have a Moses that is leading the Jewish people to a desolate land, according to Hecataeus. So not, something that is, that he considers Judah to be a desolate land. He doesn't give the name Judah, but basically a desolate land after their expulsion from Egypt. Okay. And he founds Jerusalem. So he's just to recap that also, he is a polis builder founding Jerusalem and other cities. So a polis in the ancient world was a major city with cities around it that it governs. So it's really a polis builder. And again, he's in the list with other polis builders. He's compared to other polis builders. He's also the one building the Jewish temple and establishing the cult in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Now, he's also, according to Hecataeus, the one who divides the Jewish people into 12 tribes. Okay, so that's not the tradition about the 12 tribes being the sons of Jacob, for example, is not known at that time. Now, maybe I'll pause here. The church fathers and Josephus, when they talk about these Hellenistic sources that talk about the Exodus and about Moses, they say, well, they're trying to slander us, and they're ignorant because they're not familiar with the scriptures, and arguments of that nature. These are, of course, that kind of argumentation by the church fathers, by Josephus and others, assumes that the Bible was already well known, was already established, already authoritative as it was in their day. And of course, that's not a very scientific approach to the data. Okay, so we cannot, of course, us as scholars, as modern scholars, we can't just assume that these Hellenistic sources were necessarily malevolent or ignorant.
I was going to say they're taking the narrative at face value anyway, assuming Moses really was back here. I mean, when they're making arguments, so you can't. Oh well, he's Bronze Age. Like, you can't just accept that they're going to be able to actually assess this properly when they're just kind of buying the narrative that Moses is back here, right there at the Bronze Age collapse, approximately. Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, we know
absolutely. Yeah. Now, there is, I mean, clearly these texts that were written, again, on the cusp between the 4th and the 3rd century, these texts can be exploited to criticize the Jewish people, and they were. And that is what Josephus is arguing against. So he says, well, they're using these texts against us, to criticize our history, and I'm going to respond to that. That makes perfect sense, of course, as one who wants to protect his people. But of course, that is not a scientific position. So we need to look at these texts and take them at face value. Take the Hellenistic texts to allow them to speak for themselves, and to see if there's anything that we can see in these texts that points to any kind of familiarity with the biblical version of these stories. Now, in Hecataeus, we see a departure from Egypt, but it's a completely different Exodus from the one that we have in the Bible. Okay.
Point you brought up. I was thinking the Bible says it's a land flowing with milk and honey, and there's people populated everywhere. Here it says he's desolate. Like, there's nobody there. There's nothing. It's desert. That's an odd thing.
That's an odd thing, and that is a very important point that you just brought up, because the Bible insists on this. And in fact, the spies that Moses sends into the land, when they come back and criticize the land as a land that is eating its inhabitants, right, consuming its inhabitants, and the land that is basically desolate. And because they criticize the land, they die, and so when they come back, except for Joshua and Caleb, who do speak well about the land, and they survive. That is very, very probably a polemic stance, one of many, that the Bible, that the story of the Exodus takes against the Hellenistic narrative. Okay, so the Hellenistic narrative says that the land is desolate, and basically the authors of that part of the Pentateuch of the Exodus say, no, you can't say that this is a desolate land. This is a bountiful land flowing with milk and honey, and anyone who says that might be worthy of death. So, according to the way they see it, and so that is a very strong polemical position against the Hellenistic narrative. That's a great.
People are paying attention to that, because in the end of this, you're going to notice that when there are polemical responses, it looks like, and I want to tease people just saying, it looks like the biblical text is reacting to all of these different narratives.
Absolutely, it absorbs some of these narratives. And we'll get to why I believe it absorbs, and it's not original with the Hebrew text, but it absorbs some of these narratives. It expands other narratives, and those the authors of this of the Exodus narrative felt was critical or negative towards their own people, then they polemicized against it. So it's not always polemicizing against the Greek sources, but also absorbing them and expanding upon them and building up from them. So it's a of course, like any kind of assimilation, it's multi-layered and complex. So Hecataeus did that. Also presented the Jews as having a way of life that differs from other nations, that they are removed from other peoples, and also that Moses established the priests as the leaders of the Jewish people, and the high priest was the kind of the top person in Jewish society, and that position was, according to Hecataeus, established by Moses, and that both the priest and the high priest were elected based on the strength and the quality of their character. Now, in the Persian period, we know that the high priest, the Jewish high priest, and the priests in Jerusalem and probably in other places where they had temples. We mentioned a temple a Jewish temple in Elephantine. There was a Jewish temple on Mount Gerizim. There's no reason to doubt that there were other Jewish temples at the time, also in Samaria, in the city of Samaria, although that temple has not been found, but there's no reason to doubt that there was one. And these had priests. But the high priest, we also even have a coin from the 4th century BCE with the picture of the face of the high priest, and it says Yohanan the high priest on it. So the priest had his own coin, which puts him in a position similar to the governor. The governor also minted coins to establish his authority, but also in the province of Yehud, the high priest did the same. So the priests, this image by Hecataeus of the priests being the leaders of the people might reflect the actual reality on the ground in Judah at the time. Okay, and inheritance from the Persian period on. Also, Hecataeus talks about Moses being a military leader, organizing an army and leading campaigns against the neighbors of Judea and establishing more cities and settlements around that. Okay, so that's pretty much Hecataeus in a nutshell. What I really want to point out is that we have a different Exodus, a different Moses as well. It does not show anything in this narrative that we can say is an absolute certain hint that we know that there was any knowledge of the Pentateuch by Hecataeus, of the text of the version, at least of the Exodus and of Moses that we know from the Bible. Doesn't mean that there wasn't already among the Jews some kind of oral tradition that was developing around this figure Moses. And what's important is that Hecataeus does connect the Jews with this Moses. So Moses is not just a figure, but a figure that is very much connected to the Jews. So that is important. But again, in the entire of what we have from Hecataeus, and we don't have the original, we only have quotes of him in later sources. But from what we have from Hecataeus, we cannot be sure that he had any familiarity with the narrative that will eventually make it into the Hebrew Bible.
That's a very important observation, especially when some of the stuff is contrary to what we find in the Hebrew Bible. So he was working off of awareness of a version of it. It clearly is not the version we have now.
Yes, absolutely. It's not. It's certainly not. And Manetho, writing around the same time, says very similar things also. He's also talking about the different exodus that the Jews went out of Egypt and settled in the country that is now called Judea, and they built a temple and Jerusalem and its temple. But this is in Manetho also. We have no, and that's a very similar, very not an identical account, but again, we don't know. We don't have the full picture for Hecataeus. But Manetho adds to this that Moses was a leper and an Egyptian priest, and served in the Egyptian temples in Heliopolis, and he eventually led the Jewish people who was a leprous people. The entire people suffered from leprosy, and he led them out, or they were expulsed from Egypt, and he led them to Jerusalem to establish that city and the temple there. Now, this is a very interesting point if you talked about polemics, because there is this question, and a lot of students often ask the question in biblical studies: why is the Pentateuch so obsessed with leprosy, especially the central part of it in Leviticus? What explains? I mean, leprosy was just a fact of life in the ancient world. There were all kinds of treatments and maybe mystical and magical rituals around this, and you would treat lepers in various ways by keeping them outside of the habitations of the cities and the villages. But it wasn't an obsession in Leviticus especially, but not only. Leprosy becomes almost a mythical thing in itself, because you have the leprosy of the skin, but you also have the leprosy of the home, of the walls of the house, and of the clothes. And so it becomes this entire thing. And this was that the Hebrews come from a leprous background, which is not good. Of course, it's a slander against the Jewish people. That kind of slander continued throughout antiquity, okay, into the Common Era. And the Jewish authors of course, had to combat that in different ways. And it looks like the Bible is so obsessed with this. I mean, the Pentateuch is so obsessed with this also for polemical reasons. They want to show, no, we are not only not deriving from this leprous background, but look at how strict we really are with leprosy, how we always keep them outside the camp, always keep them away from the temple, always, and we have the priests always check them again and again, and after 7 days, and and even the house and even the clothes. Look at how strict we are in reality, or at least in myth, with regards to leprosy. So I think this obsession in the Bible with leprosy is also part of a polemical response to this slander. I mean, it's really a very slanderous. Some scholars call it a form of anti-Semitism. I wouldn't go that far, and that's a little anachronistic as well. But it is slanderous towards the Jewish people, and the Jewish people did, and we see it, argue against this. So that argument is captured in the biblical text, and that I believe explains the level of obsession that we have with leprosy in the Pentateuch.
So this is just a focus for just a second on what you're saying here before we move on. Is simply, it makes me want to reconsider looking at the Elijah-Elisha narratives, of course, with the king who comes, dip yourself 7 times in the water. Notice it's not an Israelite here. It's a foreign king. So, right. Hey, even we can cure and heal. Our magi, our heroes, our man gods, Ish Elohim, can heal you. So you got to come to us. So here is another way of playing that polemic. And then another interesting thing is just how obsessed the New Testament is carrying this tradition with Jesus healing lepers. And so climate makes me wonder, and I'm asking you, you're not just saying leprosy, even though leprosy, if we're going to be technical and scholarly, we got to focus on that. But I'm wondering how impactful the polemic would be that they would then want to wash 17 times every time they go to do a meal. Like, it is impacted them psychologically, that these cleanliness laws that we see that keep going in rituals amongst Jews, it makes their religious life so, I need to clean this and I can't have this touch that. And I need to be like, so everyone can't wonder, are we clean people? Are we very ritualistically pure? Like, it overcompensates. The pendulum swings, and it shows in the archaeology with all the bathing pools and all of the kosher diet. I wonder if all of that is Hellenistic in its impact on the people.
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think that that there are layers, and things build one upon the other. I think clearly, and we do see it, because the sources like Josephus and others do say when we are being slandered by this idea that we were lepers, and we were not, and they're trying to show how this is not the case. I think this was also this argument was embedded into the Bible, so that they can point back and show, look, our own books show that we are really, really strict about leprosy and about purity.
So you wouldn't get beyond necessarily.
Well, I mean, I'll be very cautious about taking this more than that. But clearly, once you establish that, so that level of intensity of focus on leprosy, it creates its own traditions. Okay, so that focus on leprosy is established in the Bible, and then you have later sources like the New Testament, for example, and like Qumran, the sectarian texts and others, build on top of that and continue these ideas onwards, even not necessarily acknowledging the fact that this was written in the polemical, from a polemical perspective, but that's just they're simply building on top of that. So I'd be cautious about saying that this is all necessarily polemical, but I think that the crux of the obsession with purity and with the leprosy, again, the leprosy not just of the skin but of the house and the clothes, this obsession of a kind of a almost mythical form of leprosy. I mean, again, you go after 7 days and the priest checks you again. There is no leprosy, no skin disease that evolves in the speed of, that we can in the 7 day period you can see a difference. So it's clearly something that was designed to be an argument, okay, against something. And so I think that that's a big part of what came into this. Now, of course, once you start down that rabbit hole, you add more context into it, and you embed it into other narratives as well. But the idea was, look, we have to have an argument against these slanderous accusations, and we're going to put that into our authoritative text.
And then you bring up Moses, the the interesting moment where he ends up leper, but
that's right.
He's immediately healed by God to show.
That's right.
God, yeah. Can you explain that just briefly as while we're highlighting this?
Sure. So in Exodus 4, in chapter 4 of the book of Exodus, you have the burning bush, and the latter part of the burning bush scene. And then there's this scene where the people will want to know your name, and they want to know who sent me, because Yahweh is sending him to Egypt. Yeah, it's in verse 7 of chapter 4. And then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. Excuse me, he says before that in verse 7, put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand inside his cloak. And when he took it out, it was leprous like snow. And then verse 7, put it back inside your cloak. And then he took it out and it was healed. So this seems also like a polemics against this figure of Moses as the leprous Egyptian priest. Okay. And so it says, no, he wasn't a leprous Egyptian priest. He had Yahweh with him, and Yahweh is able to heal him from leprosy. So if that, there's no, it does not make sense that if he is so close with Yahweh, and Yahweh is the deity that heals from leprosy, then your story, your Hellenistic story, cannot be correct, right?
Osarseth is the name of that priest. And I'm curious to know where that name came from, but that's a different show.
We don't know. Yeah, we don't know. There are all kinds of theories about this, but we really don't know. So the entire people were considered leprous, and Moses himself was considered leprous, and there is clear polemics against that. That was clearly considered slanderous. Also, Josephus mentioned about Manetho that we just mentioned earlier, that Manetho, according to Josephus, would have the Egyptian multitude, and that had the leprosy. So also Egyptians that came to live with the Jews, leprous Egyptians came to live with the Jews, and they came out of Egypt with the Jews. So that is, according to Josephus, found in Manetho. Again, we don't have the works of Manetho today, but Josephus says that that's when Manetho says. Again, late 4th century, early 3rd century BCE.
And just to focus on the Manetho emphasis of this version of Moses, this version of Israelite people, the Jewish people, this version of what we're reading and the biblical one, someone might go, well, what makes you think that, why didn't Manetho just change the biblical one instead of trying to say that the biblical one is working off Manetho to combat that? Why can't it be the reverse? Is that something we can address as we go along, and why you think that's less likely?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can talk about this just to finish the thought on the mixed multitude. So Josephus says that Manetho already talked about this kind of mixed multitude of Egyptians and Jews that share the same affliction, both being lepers. coming out of Egypt, and this is also found in Exodus 12, that a mixed multitude also came up with or went up with them, very much, and with a lot of livestock, etc. So this idea of a mixed multitude coming out also appears in Manetho, echoed in the Pentateuch. Now, Manetho, writing in the late fourth or early, or more likely early 3rd century BCE about this, was dependent on Egyptian sources. Okay, there is nothing in the text. The really important elements of the story. So, if they wanted to, for example, this is an argument from science, but basically, if he wanted to argue against the biblical text that we are familiar with, there are so many elements within the biblical text that he could have argued against, and he simply does not show any knowledge of them, including the Ten Commandments or the whole episode on Mount Sinai. Or even the burning bush, or all kinds of, or Moses, or the 10 plagues, like the major events. We were talking about relatively small events like the leprosy of Moses, which is in two verses in the Bible. But clearly, he is not familiar with the major events. He would have addressed that. Definitely, he would have addressed that had he known about them.
Okay. Especially since he, just for the context of the viewer, for those who don't know, Manetho is an Egyptian. Right. He values the honor of Egyptian people and their pedigree and whatnot, which is why I think he's jabbing at, Jewish people here in this writing. So when you have 10 plagues attack Egyptians, when you have Egyptians drowning in a sea, when you have, this guy would not have sat back and not barked back at these ideas. So your thinking, as the viewer, can drive with us in this car, is to say, wait till we get to the end and these other traditions. You'll notice all the biblical text kind of encompasses a comeback, or in a way complements the whole various different traditions that we're seeing. And therefore it looks more likely the biblical is reacting to the whole totality rather than it being the earliest. Because if it was, we'd hear Manetho crying about these other stories.
Now, I want to be very cautious about this. Again, two things. First of all, I'm not saying that there wasn't any oral tradition among the Jews that already had a version of an idea like an Exodus already kind of being whispered around, and Manetho was knowledgeable, not of the version that we know in the Bible, not of the fuller version that we know from the Bible, but of some oral tradition that was already gaining popularity among the Jews in the early 3rd century BC. So he might have been familiar with that. We need to be really, really cautious and not just say, well, they were just responding to and also keep in mind that even Manetho and Hecataeus and all of that, again, these are quoted in much later sources that might have also been edited and themselves also edited and redacted later on, and they were definitely also composed over time. Even Manetho and Hecataeus and others, they composed this over a certain period of time, maybe 10, 20 years. We need to be very cautious about this and not simplify this too much. But there is clearly a level of polemical, certainly with regards to leprosy, for example. I mean, that is very clear, and the Jewish writers always say that we are slandered with this, and so clearly they don't want to be slandered on this point, and justifiably so. And so they would add this obsession with leprosy into the text of the Pentateuch. That makes perfect sense. And again, other forms of polemics as well. Okay, but we need to be very, very cautious. So I am actually writing an article about this particular point, about the different Moseses and the Exoduses according to the Hellenistic period. And what I'm trying to show in the article is I'm really trying to create, one of the goals of the article is to try to show which sources maybe knew of each other and maybe are polemicizing with them. So even the Hellenistic sources also polemicized amongst themselves, not just with the Jewish sources. Okay, but even the different Hellenistic scholars said, okay, well, Manetho says this, and Hecataeus says this, but I will provide some additional information that maybe came from a different, maybe he knew a different Jewish tradition at the time, or maybe he wanted to develop his own. But there's a lot of give and take between the different traditions, even among the Hellenistic traditions. It's not one. It's far from a uniform narrative. There are a lot of different. We won't have time. I mean, unless we do a multi-hour episode, we won't have time to go over all of the different. I do address that in the article, but the idea is that there's a lot. I'm trying to show how the relationship between the different Hellenistic authors might have been over time. So, for example, who might be aware of whom, and of course the relationship between the biblical text and those Hellenistic texts. What is interesting and what is becoming clear as I work on this article is that the Hellenistic authors are polemicizing amongst themselves on certain aspects of the text, but not on everything. And they do accept, they do have a kind of a nucleus that goes on and is accepted by almost all of them. But the biblical text seems to be polemicizing, or not only polemicizing, but at least in dialogue with all of these other sources. So either it absorbs them and expands upon them, or changes them, or polemicizing against them. Okay, so the idea of Moses as a lawgiver also appears, of course, in the Pentateuch. But what's really interesting, as we said at the beginning of this episode, there is zero evidence of these laws being followed at any point in time before the 3rd century BCE. So even though the Pentateuch presents Moses as a lawgiver, or really as a law mediator between Yahweh and the people, no familiarity with these laws can be traced before Alexandria, before the beginning of the 3rd century BCE. Okay, so that idea that Moses was a lawgiver, we already said that Theophrastus did not know about this. He did not put Moses into his compendium of great lawgivers, and so it almost, I would say it's almost certain, but let's just say it makes perfect sense that the redactors of the Pentateuch added laws that would make sense for them progressively. I'm not saying it was necessarily in one shot, but they added it into the narrative of the Exodus later on as not polemics there. It's not against the Hellenistic version, but basically enhancing the Hellenistic version and saying, yes, you just say that he was a lawgiver. Look at the laws that he provided. Look at the 10 Commandments. Look at the whole set of laws that were provided by. So they don't disagree with the Hellenistic authors, but they do expand significantly on that particular point. So it's not always against. It's sometimes going with them and expanding upon it. But again, these laws are simply unknown before as far as from what we know from the thousands of Jewish sources that we have from that period. These laws were simply never followed before the 3rd century BC. So that's a pretty good argument as to why the idea that Moses was a lawgiver was early, and then the Exodus said, okay, well, we agree. That's actually something that is good. It's not slanderous. It shows that that they are people of laws, and that they had the great lawgiver. That's not a slanderous comment on the Jewish people. So they took it with two hands. They absorbed it, and they said, well, yeah, let's expand on this and show how great our laws really are. So that explains a big chunk of the Pentateuch that's devoted to laws.
Before we get into your next source, just to make the point of like the way I've been balancing the two options when I'm trying to communicate this with my scholarly friends, is to say, look, I have so many good guesses, because all scholarship is the best guess based upon the data they're looking at. Like, I have so many good guesses to think Moses, the lawgiver, the city builder, like everything we're seeing in these traditions and the ideas that we see in the Pentateuch, like a lot of this makes a lot of sense during the Hellenistic period to have invented that character this way. And I have a lot of reasons. I mean, we can get into the Ethiopian wife of Moses, which we have
Sure.
these other Hellenistic sources that have Ethiopian connections and tie-ins with Moses as well. And there's like
Right.
tons of this stuff. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, whoa, okay, I have a lot of dialogue when we have zero of that in the 5th century BCE in places you would expect something, I would imagine. Instead of arguments of silence and assuming it's there, I actually have good reasons to think when the conversations are showing up that we have evidence of it. That seems to be the better path that I would lean into before I go small group of scribes, 5 or 6 dudes passed on for centuries amongst 5 or 6 dudes' families that are hidden, that we just have no evidence of. We have nothing there. That does not seem to be the stronger path I would take versus here we have like evidence and good reasons to say why they would have invented this. Good
Absolutely.
reason.
And look,
So-
I mean, all of these Hellenistic sources are these are not historical. None of them. Manetho's account is not historical. Hecataeus' account is not historical. Artapanus and all of these other sources, they are not historical sources. They are all invented. Okay, so why would the biblical one be non-invented? They're all created from the same cloth. And so,
Well, I
yeah,
don't want to strawman them. They won't say that it's not invented. They just want to say it's invented in the 7th, 8th century. And I think there's more reasons to think there's better data, I think, to argue why it would have been invented later.
Absolutely. And again, there's no reason to say, as you said, there's no reason to say that it was necessarily 7th century at all. There is simply no support for that. And again, outside the Bible, there's not just an argument from silence, but we have a lot of material that goes squarely against what is the laws of the Bible, right? The commandments. So we have not only silence about the commandments themselves and the narrative of Moses and the Exodus and all of that stuff, but we do have negative evidence about people following following the almost anti or not anti, but contrary to the biblical commandments. So we don't have any positive, but we do have negative evidence, and that says a lot. That really says a lot along thousands of documents of all kinds. We have contracts, we have administrative, we have letters, we have all kinds of communication formats, dealing with personal issues, dealing with historical events, dealing with the empire, everything, really covering every aspect of life from that period, and there is not a slightest hint of awareness of anything, any kind of commandment, anything from the Pentateuch or the Bible in general. So when you have this weight of again, evidence, when I say evidence, it's a deafening silence, but when it is so absolute across thousands of documents from a long period of time, and you do have this negative evidence that shows that people are doing things that are not that go squarely against the biblical the norms. It's a very, very strong argument. And these things change at the beginning of the 3rd century. The change is so clear at that time, with the names and with different traditions popping up at the time, that it's really clear cut. Now, as a historians, we look for triggers. What caused a change? What made things change? And usually triggers are pretty important. I mean, something that changes elements of an identity of a people. These are usually major events, occupation by a foreign power, from imperial power, for example, the Persians coming in, or the new Babylonians coming in, or the Assyrians, or whatever it is, or the Egyptians. That is a trigger. But you have to say, what was the trigger then? And of course, you need to look at the characteristics of that trigger. And certainly the big trigger at that time, when we start seeing changes in the archaeological records, so for example, those names that start changing, and of course the Hellenistic sources that start writing about the Jews, only in the late fourth or early third, and again, as I said, like the names like Yosef and Shimon that start popping up in Egypt in the late fourth century. What was the trigger then? So clearly the trigger was the kind of the dawn of the Hellenistic period, and my book argues that it was the Library of Alexandria that triggered and kind of catapulted this huge enterprise of creating an authoritative Jewish text, which eventually became the Bible. Again, I'm not saying that there weren't older sources that were incorporated into this, but and there were, and as I said, I even have an article about this. So I'm not denying that there was something older, but the enterprise of actually putting it all together, editing it, redacting it, and composing parts of it as well from scratch. Not saying that, I mean, clearly they also composed new stuff. Was triggered by the Alexandria Library, and these early echoes are all in the sphere of Alexandria. All of these authors, Hellenistic authors that we talked about, operated in Alexandria. Okay, as I said, there was a substantial Jewish community already operating at the time. So Alexandria is clearly, to me, the historical trigger that caused this to happen. And they also followed, as I said, we don't only look at the trigger, at the event, but you also look at the characteristics of the trigger and the fact that they followed pretty much the same, and I'm not the first scholar to say that, but that they followed the same, the Jewish people working on this authoritative text that will become the Bible followed very much the same ideas and the same manners of approaching a text that their Greek neighbors or Greek and Macedonian neighbors followed in the Library of Alexandria. Okay, so they followed the same way of approaching the text, the same aesthetics. So clearly, the Library of Alexandria seems to be a very, very solid trigger for the elaboration of the biblical text.
I can already picture someone in the audience going, no. The people of Israel just backslid. That's why they were practicing and acting polytheistic, non-kosher diet, non-law abiding, don't mention it. They're just sinners. Now, of course, wouldn't any society think that? I mean, that seems to be the kind of modus operandi that happens, right? You get in like the origins of Islam. What do? They say the world was pagan, and then next thing you know, it's all monotheistic. But now I've actually done recent interviews with people who have done epigraphic evidence and showed that actually this idea of like polytheism and many gods in the Arabian Peninsula wasn't. It's been 3 centuries before Muhammad shows up that they're already practicing monotheism everywhere. Like Judaism and Christianity and forms of monotheism that may be kind of neutral or other, they're not like polytheistic. The point I'm getting at is like, there's always this anachronistic to say the world was pagan. Look at the sleepers of Ephesus, right? Or you can go even further back into Greek sources where the very source Epimenides that is used by Acts, he's put to sleep in a cave of Zeus for 57 years, and he comes out with the wisdom and knowledge that you see with a lot of these authors are talking about, the philosopher's mind. It's just, they're going to say that. There's typical people who want to go, well, the reason all the people of Israel are not practicing the laws, they backslid. But the narratives, Josiah, Ezra, Nehemiah, they kind of tell you that everyone follows it.
It's interesting that you mentioned Epimenides in the book of Acts, in Act 17, because that, I mean, even the character of Paul that is set in Athens in that chapter basically says, this God that you worship unknowingly, the unknown God, this is the one I have come to preach to you, basically, and so he's basically assimilating. I mean, that in of itself is a syncretistic. I mean, that's a term that I'm not particularly fond of, but I'll use it for the sake of simplicity. But even that statement by this Paul character in the book of Acts. Again, I'm not saying that the historical Paul necessarily said that, but in the book of Acts, it basically is assimilating this unknown God of Epimenides to. And you know why I'm saying that? Do you know why I'm saying that this is this unknown God is from Epimenides? Because according to the legend, Epimenides was this major figure like Pericles, and he was from Crete, from the island of Crete, and he was called into Athens to help against this plague, and he just basically told them, "Where just let your troops of goats and your herds go, and wherever they pasture, wherever they sit down, and they just sit in the field, there you established an altar to the unknown God." So the idea, that's also Epimenides. So the idea of that to establish an altar to the unknown God comes from Epimenides. And so this character of Paul says, oh, this unknown God is the same God. Okay, It's not a strict monotheistic view that this character of Paul is proposing here. It says it's the same God. Okay, you call it. It's exactly. You have a name for it. We have a name for it, and this appears also in the letter of Aristeas. In the letter of Aristeas, he basically, this pseudo Aristeas, is writing supposedly to Ptolemy and saying what the Jews call Yahweh, we call D or Zeus. And so this assimilation continues. We see the assimilation, and ergo the non-monotheistic thought or non-strict monotheistic thought in the 2nd century BCE, and in whenever that part of the Book of Acts was written in the late first, early second centuries of the Common Era. So yeah, but that idea that there is that Yahweh can be assimilated to other deities continued, and is even in the New Testament.
Yeah, very powerful point. And my next video actually talks about this a little bit, but like the Theos Hypsistos, this unknown God, even the quote unquote, I hate using the word pagan, but I'm only using it because it's so like deeply entrenched in people's minds. Non-Jewish, non-Christians are literally monotheist in the ancient way it was used. And that's another difficult definition, right? Because it's late that we have the strictness attributed. The world was full of gods and demons and deities and stuff.
Yeah. Strict monotheism is really an Islamic development. Strict monotheism, with the Tawheed of Islam, which is one of the pillars of Islam. But strict monotheism is an Islamic innovation, really. It came back into Judaism through the Rambam, through Maimonides, but we don't have time to talk about that as well.
Got it.
Yeah.
But it's just a point that you're saying, and it's like, again, no wonder these non-Jews were like going to synagogue and going to the Christian movement, because it was so accommodational to what they already were practicing and starting to believe. So there's That's so right. much interesting here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there was, so also on that point, I'm thinking about it because we're kind of opening a Pandora's box here, but basically I'll try to make it as short as possible, because it's an important point to understand. Things are always more complex than they seem to be, okay, in history. Always. There's always complexity. There's always multifaceted things that are happening. And so when in scholarship, when we talk about early Judaism, we really use the term Yahwism, okay, when like what happened in Elephantine and in the Judaism of before the 2nd century BCE. We use the term Yahwism, and that describes a cult or a cultic system. And I'm using the word cult not in a negative sense, but I'm using it as a cultic or faith system. So it basically means that a deity by the name of Yahweh, YWH or the YWHW, is the head of the pantheon, the main deity. And that's pretty much it. There are no laws. There are no specific. There are rituals, but there are no specific commandments or laws or anything like that. So talking about Judaism is when the laws become central, and that's really dated to the 2nd century BCE, and around that time we see these laws start to be actually followed widely. And so before that period, we really talk about Yahwism. The thing is, we over the past few decades, since we started talking in these terms, Yahwism versus Judaism, the idea was that Yahwism morphed into Judaism. So early Judaism is Yahwism, and then it became Judaism, and almost like Yahwism ceased to exist at that point. That's absolutely not true. Yahwism continued. It continued and even was much stronger, much more popular than Judaism or Christianity when it began. Okay, Yahwism continued. This idea of Yah as a central god, as a head of a federation of deities, as a head of the pantheon, continued well into the Common Era. And so, and so Yahwism. So when you talk about the kind of the non-Jews that are attracted to elements of Judaism, that also comes from Yahwism. Yahwism was extremely popular in the Roman Empire. Okay, especially if you look at the amulets, if you look at the magical texts and curses and things like that, they invoke the name of Yahweh as a deity all over the Roman Empire, everywhere. Okay,
and isn't this where, like, etymologically people saw those similarities, like Plutarch and others who were like, hold on, they call upon Yahweh like the Jews who are calling, they're worshiping Dionysus and stuff like that, and they're found similarities.
Right. So yeah, absolutely. And Yahweh is found, as I said, across all over the Roman Empire. That name also appears in Qumran, and it's in amulets everywhere. I mean, you find that name. It is extremely ubiquitous across the empire. But not only Yahweh, but the name Sabaoth was seen as a deity. Okay, so Yahweh Sabaoth, or Adonai was seen as a separate deity. Okay, under Yahweh. So Yahweh was kind of the head of a federation of deities, and these names that we associate with Yahweh as titles were seen in Yahwism of that era as deities, actually as divine powers under this federation, whose head of the pantheon was Yahweh.
This got me really. We went off Moses, right? And I know we didn't really.
But it's connected. It's all connected because Moses is. I mean, the idea of Moses and the Exodus also continues to develop during the entire time.
This really makes me wonder. So when we look at, I almost want to use the word Zadokite because that is an actual thing, that there are particular priestly groups that are calling themselves Zadokites, but there's other scholars who've written pointing out there's forms of Yahwism where you have a Mosaic kind of Torah building group. Then you have a Enochian building group, right? So now you have a Yahweh that is not Mosaic. Even though Moses shows up as a character, he's really insignificant. The most central revealer is Enoch. And then it makes me wonder if there are these Romans and Greeks that are not categorized under this Jewish group that are Yahwist, what's their story, right? You got Enoch, you got Moses. Do we have any hint at some of their kind of narratives that you know of? I mean, is it Gnosticism? Is it, what we consider Gnostics? Like, what is going on here?
So here you're jumping exactly into what I said about complexity. Everything is extremely complex. The picture becomes, I mean, it's like an explosion after the kind of the 2nd century BCE and onwards, an explosion of ideas. So the Enochian school is certainly one interpretation. The interpretation of the different sects, like the Essenes, for example, or what we find in Qumran, is another. Takes it into another level that is, of course, conversant with the Jubilees and with Enoch. You have the Gnostics. Now, the Gnostics, again, another term that I don't like because Gnostic is a pejorative term, but we'll use it just for the sake of clarity or of convenience. But the Gnostics are basically Yahwists. Okay, they're not Jews or Christians. There's a big debate about. Let me clarify this. They're not necessarily not Jews and Christians. They could be either one or not, or not. Again, the picture is always extremely complex. Gnosticism is basically and you probably know that there are many different sects within Gnosticism. There are the Sethians, and so you have all of these different sects, and they all have their own, and they build their own mythology and their own stories and their own mysteries and their own liturgy, and kind of split out from one another, but they are all within this realm of Yahwism. Okay, they continue to see a pantheon of Yahwistic divine forces. Again, Yahweh is one, Sabaoth is another, etc., etc. But on Sabbath, for example, on the Sabbath day, they might go to the synagogue of the Jews who keep the Torah. Okay, they might, and they probably did. So they might have seen themselves as Jews, but also believing in also kind of gravitating towards Yahwism. Again,
these categories, like, you notice how you had to use the word Jew? I know your frustration because you're like, they see themselves as Jews, but what I mean by Jew isn't like what we think of Jews today. Like, there's such a porous boundary. It's so amazing to think about the ancient world. Sorry to interrupt.
No, absolutely. The ancient world is, I mean, especially in that period, it is absolutely kind of it's simmering, right? It's when you read these sources, and that's what I really love about my job. When I work with these sources, the level of detail and the level of energy that comes out of these ways of thinking, and all of these polemics, even among the different Gnostic groups and the different sects in Judea and with Samaria and in Egypt and in other places, and they kind of exchange information, and they add to various interpretations and to various traditions. Everything is kind of really very, it's very energetic, and into that, I mean, early Christianity kind of comes into that, right, and provides its own. And it's amazing how the early Christians also kind of absorbed from all over. I think one of the reasons that Christianity became such a force in the Roman Empire was that Yahwism already prepared the road for them. Okay, and already, and you see that in the New Testament, there's a lot of dialogue with Yahwism. Okay, I mean, the idea of always dealing with the demons and expelling the demons and the power of the word, of the logos. All of these things are very much related to the interaction between Yahwism in the Hellenistic world.
You already have stories of Solomon, right? Like there's already these narratives of him being the chief magician capable of controlling demons. Here in that same kind of context, you have Jesus, this newer, better Moses. Again, like Enochian, like Moses, or
that's Mosaic a great tradition. Absolutely, that's a great point. And Moses was seen as a magician. And that's another polemic.
I was going to ask you to hook us in back to Moses with this whole thing, even because this is
that's right. That's right, because Moses was seen as an alchemist, as a magician. He appears in lists of famous magi, together with other famous names like Apollobex and others. And so Moses is listed as a famous magi, is a famous alchemist, a famous. I mean, that was science for the ancient world, right? The famous scientist. That's the alchemy is what they saw, what they considered to be science. So Moses is also presented that way, and in the Bible there is also a kind of they're dealing with that, right? With Moses in the palace of Pharaoh, turning the stick into a crocodile, and vice versa, and of course the plagues, turning the waters into blood, for example, or even splitting the Red Sea. So he is this magush. He's this magi, who is able to make, by divine intervention, but to make the elements of nature do as he wishes.
I was also thinking of the
Yeah,
serpent, right? The copper serpent, and then Aaron, which
absolutely,
is like
that's right.
sidekick, right? Telling them, "Give me your gold," and melting it down to craft a god out of it. That he had magical abilities. They thought alchemy and even metallurgy was like an ancient form of magical capabilities to take one form of element and make it into another. The same way magical elements of wine. This is why Jesus not only is the new Dionysus and the new Moses. He's doing everything. He is the one who is lifted up in the wilderness like the serpent. He is that killer and the magician and the demonic exorcist, the whole nine. He checks all the boxes. That's what I think they did a good job of.
Absolutely, but all of that was prepared. But when the New Testament texts came out and these images of Jesus that were crafted, they were crafted according to elements that really resonated in the Roman world at the time. And Yahwism again was so popular, that it was very easy to play with these themes, and to convince. And that's why I think Christianity was able to get to spread very, very quickly. And that's, you have to credit Yahwism for this. And again, Taoism was bigger than Judaism and much more popular than Judaism and Christianity combined at the time. Now, another tradition about Moses is that he was the teacher of Orpheus. That's a very interesting tradition, but that comes from a play on words, or a play on the name Moses, and basically saying, "Oh, Moses, that's Moseus, meaning the muse. He's the basically the muse and the teacher of Orpheus." Now, Orpheus was this great legendary musician in the ancient world, but there are several ancient sources that say, well, Orpheus learned to sing and learned music from Moses, because Moses is the muse, Moseus. So it's a play on the word, on the name Moses. I believe that in the Bible, the idea that Moses was stuttering is also a polemical, kind of polemical argument against this Orpheic, this idea that he was the source of Orpheus. No, he was stuttering. He could not speak. Therefore, he, of course, could not be this famous singer or famous musician. That might have been just kind of an anecdote type of polemical argument.
One comment on that, to just get your 2 cents, is that because they're willing to polemic this and have him become a stutterer in biblical text that we have, this doesn't close the door that there were Jews who did ride into, yeah, he was the teacher of Orpheus, and they were super Hellenistic.
Absolutely.
So they were really accommodating it and saying, yeah, and what if the name is derivative in some way with this idea in mind? I don't know.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, in Aristobulus, so that's about mid 2nd century to early 1st century BCE, there is a Orpheic hymn, an actual hymn that is quoted there, a long version and in the short version of it. And it is an Orpheic hymn according to the standard of the mysteries, the Orpheic mysteries, and the hymns of that practice. And it is about Moses, and it does call him Moseus in this hymn. And there are a lot of elements there that are very much connected to certain elements that we do find in the but again, this is late second, early first century BCE, very much on genre with the Orphaic mysteries, and it was almost certainly written by a Jewish author, but with the Hellenistic standard of the Orphaic mysteries, and it's beautiful. It's really a beautiful text.
Wow, this is just it really, what you're doing is you're stretching my brain and going, man, categories and ideas of these characters, like, it is a much more porous and bigger than I realized type of thing. The inner dialogue due to Hellenism, and sure, there's probably dialogue in other formats. I mean, clearly, like you said, those catalysts of empires that come in and occupy or control the region. You notice when we look at the Astrakhan, when we look at the epigraphic evidence of we'll just use the term Jews for the sake of it, or the people of this land at the time in the period that are Yahwist, the Yahwist, they have Yahweh with a knot, they have Yahweh with all these other gods, showing like, here's this major influence that's happening. And then maybe back and forth dialogue and influence. But once you get to the Hellenistic period, there's this spread that just, it's just like, it's just the way it mixes and goes. It's amazing just to think of how these communities.
That's the energy. That's the energy. Absolutely, that's the energy that I was talking about. It like, there's nothing before the 3rd century, and then there's a explosion. And I'm not talking about necessarily the epigraphic findings, although we start finding names, as I said, like Yehoseph and Simeon in the epigraphic finding in archaeology. And we start in the 2nd century, we start seeing people in archaeology actually adhering to certain laws. And there are things like this letter of Pseudo Aristeas and the tragedy of Ezekiel the tragedian, who wrote in the somewhere in the 2nd century, also probably maybe late for early first, but most likely the middle of the 2nd century, maybe somewhere in the 2nd century. We don't really know. Ezekiel the tragedian, who wrote in Alexandria in an actual play. He wrote a play that was almost certainly performed in Alexandria, written according to the Hellenistic standard of how to write tragic plays. He set the Exodus as a play, and he, for example, clearly knows about the Septuagint version of the or a Septuagint version of the Exodus, but not exactly what we know from the Exodus or from the Septuagint. It does, and what's interesting about it does, it does have elements that are different from the Septuagint, but he also adds Moses on the throne, almost an apocalyptic vision of Moses on the throne with an apocalyptic or proto-apocalyptic, if you will, flavor to it. So he adds something that is really not there. This is all second century BCE. So we talked about the Orphaic hymn, 2nd century BCE, that has Mosaics in an Orphaic setting, and this Ezekiel tragedian around the same time. Now, the letter of Aristeas talks about Jewish playwrights. So that could be, he might be referring to Ezekiel the tragedian, probably does. And since this seems to have been the most celebrated one, and so that would be a good reason to date Ezekiel tragedian to the 2nd century BCE. So all of these different sources, this is the energy that we see at the time. All of these different sources come together. They absorb parts of the story, and they add to it or they change it. It's a very, very energetic, very kind of effervescent period. And the biblical text is written against this background. Okay, now clearly, having all of these very different versions being promoted at the same time. Now, not only different Moseses, but different Exoduses at the same time, promoted at the same time, shows that the text was not yet canonized. Now, of course, talking about canonization at that time period is anachronistic, but the text was not set. There was not an authoritative version. Okay, and I mean, certainly the biblical version that we know was certainly not authoritative yet, and people would either polemicize. The polemics can be from both sides in later periods, in the first century now into the Common Era. So now the Greek authors from that time period might now polemicize against the biblical text, right?
Reconsider looking at Jesus and the sayings in the Gospels too, when it talks about, and Moses wrote about me, or these quotes. He's not dealing with a fixed canon. If we go back and look at who
That's
these
correct.
be, this mindset that you're describing of how we could see floating authority type text or narratives that are floating around makes me kind of want to know what one is this author of the Gospels working with, especially when you have Josephus, for example, again, talking about how fluid this is. And I mentioned this before we recorded, how he has him have an apotheosis. He literally has Moses taken by God, and without dying, he ascends, just like Romulus does, like Jesus does, into a cloud. He has another ascension with
Enoch in the Bible, right? And
Enoch, yeah,
absolutely.
Or Elijah,
Absolutely.
if you want to kind of look at Elijah that way too.
Yeah, absolutely. But this is all of these different. I mean, this fascination with these stories, with these narratives, there is no hint of that before the third century, the beginning of the third century. Not the slightest hint of anything like that before. I mean, nothing. I mean, we talked about how resounding the silence is on all levels, from every aspect you look at. And there's nothing. And suddenly this explosion in narrative text with the Hellenistic sources, again, not necessarily in archaeology. That we were looking at archaeology, I think, a little bit too much to try to date the Exodus, the story of the Exodus, or to date Moses. But if you look at the Hellenistic texts and how they evolved, and this is what my article is also trying to do, is to show the evolution of these stories and how which one. It's very hard to show which one was necessarily especially because these are so fragmentary. We don't have the full works, but at least show some connections between these sources, and to show how a certain trend in the evolution of these sources occurred over time. And again, I just want to repeat the very important point that the Bible, the biblical text, or what became to be known as the Exodus in the biblical text, seems to be familiar with practically all of the main aspects of the Hellenistic texts, and they are not familiar with it. Okay, which means that it is later. Right? If it is familiar with the Hellenistic sources, but they are not familiar with it, they're not familiar necessarily with the plagues, and they're not familiar with the Ten Commandments or Sinai or all of that stuff. The firstborn and major things. And then that would be a very strong argument to say that the version that ended up being adopted by the Hebrew Bible is later. Now, again, I want to stress that it does not mean that the Jews did not have oral traditions that they were developing about something like that earlier than that, around the 4th century, early 3rd century. But there is no hint of anything like that before that time period. So. Yeah, so just to recap on that point, I'm saying that there's some major trigger happened around the turn of the 3rd century, so between the 4th and the 3rd century BCE, to make in Alexandria that caused the Jewish community there to develop this story about either to absorb it through Manetho, or to inspire to a certain degree what he was thinking, because he was mostly reliant on Egyptian sources, and Russell Gemerkin made a very good argument on that with regards to Manetho in his book. But basically, he was dependent on Egyptian sources, not on Jewish sources, and And so they might have absorbed that and developed this into an entire narrative that over time made it into a form that is more familiar to us from the Hebrew Bible.
So we are on the show Murray, and the verdict is in, are you the father or not? Okay, let me use a better example. The legal judge approach. Okay, I need a yes or no, or like as best you can guess. This may be a bit of conjecture. Scholars don't like to be conjecturing, but your best guess, based on the evidence, did Moses as a character exist before the 4th century in history?
No.
Is there any reason to think there was a lawgiver, even if his name wasn't Moses? There's a lawgiver and an Exodus before the 4th century, in your estimation?
Third century.
Okay. Do you think there was an oral tradition for centuries of a lawgiver who had some form of an Exodus? I'm referring to the Song of the Sea or the Song of Deborah. Do you think that hints at this earlier Moses story, but maybe the guy Moses?
No, clearly not. And let me just so the Song of the Sea, the Song of Deborah could be older, but they have nothing to do with law giving and all of these features. So they are independent texts. But no, I'm really looking at the scene between the 4th and the 3rd century, and really looking at the 3rd century as the main kind of hub of development of these early 3rd century of these traditions. So we really, before the early 3rd century, there was no. Even just the obsession, or not obsession, but the fascination with lawgivers in general, that comes from the Hellenistic world. Okay, I'm not saying that there were no lawgivers before. Of course, there was Hammurabi, even Darius. There were lawgivers before that, but a fascination with the person of a lawgiver. Okay, not just the person giving, but the entire character of a person being responsible for promoting and developing, designing laws for his people. That is a very Hellenistic thing. And Theophrastus, that we mentioned already, wrote this 3-volume, work. A very major work around that time period, around the 4th century, that really kind of cemented this fascination with with lawgivers. And now the Jews in Alexandria say, well, we are equal citizens of the Hellenistic world, and look, we have our own lawgiver now. Okay? And so, and Manetho comes to that based on Egyptian sources. And so, based on Egyptian sources, but again, it resonates well with what the Jews would want to do in Alexandria. So, and the Jews were apparently, pretty well established in Alexandria. Again, they were mercenaries, and they had a status. According to these sources, Alexander actually gave them land. They were landowners. They were relatively wealthy in Alexandria, and they had a relatively good life, and they were members of society, highly placed members of society. So they say, look, we have our own lawgiver as well. So this fascination with lawgivers is very Hellenistic. Okay, Plato, of course, talks about it already, but then it becomes really an established kind of genre to talk about lawgivers with Theophrastus. Also, of course, Aristo also talked about it, but Theophrastus devoting to this 3-volume work on this really cemented that. And so for the Jews to say, well, we have our own, would be very, very natural. So again, this all points out back to the 3rd century, early 3rd century BCE, establishing this Moses as a lawgiver in that time in Alexandria, showing that they are no less than their Greek neighbors in any way. But this is all mythical. It's all mythical. Right. It's mythical also. It's also mythical in the Greek sphere. It's not just mythical. Yeah. So the Greeks have no problem inventing lawgivers, who have stories around them that are clearly mythical.
Like
Okay.
Nonus. Nonus is another one that's a mythical law. I think Nonus is one of the mythical law. There's several. There's
There are
honestly,
several, yeah, absolutely, these and they are also. I mean, the major ones are also polis builders. So like Cadmus with his sister Europa, and he's the he fights the demons and fights monsters and all that. These are all legendary figures. I mean, there's no. Why wouldn't the Jews also keep on, just absorb the same or use the same literary trope? There's no reason not to. And so, what I'm basically saying is that the Exodus and the figure of Moses fit so well within the Hellenistic mindset and the Hellenistic ideology, the Hellenistic worldview. And it fits not from a position of weakness, but from a position of strength. Not because it's not like, we have to resort to mythology because we're no. I mean, that's what the strong people did. That's what the Greeks themselves did. That's what later the Romans did under Augustus, no less. So when the Romans were pretty much at one of their peaks in history, they create a mythological narrative for their own identity. So creating a mythology, we in modern times we look at mythology as almost a lie or a form of manipulation. It's something evil. It's something people who not the strong people don't do that. They don't need to resort to mythology. That's absolutely not true. And by the way, you talked about earlier. I just want to make that point because it's really important about monotheism, as if this was a linear progression from so-called polytheism, enotheism, monolatry, and all of that, to eventually monotheism, from poly to mono. That is absolutely not true. Historically, there are periods in ancient societies before the Hellenistic period, so even within the Achaemenid period, where they vacillated between a more singular deity, and a more kind of polytheistic. So, for example, in Darius in Beistun, you can read the early Persian documents, Persian inscriptions, and you have only Ahura Mazda.
right.
There are no other deities. But from Artaxerxes II onwards, you suddenly have Ahura Mazda, Mithra, and Anahita. So they actually move from a semi-monotheistic to a more polytheistic cult. And so we should never, and that's the point I'm trying to make, is that things are always more complex than they seem. We should never just assume that polytheism makes way to monotheism later on. Things go back and forth.
I must comment on this point because people go, well, Mithraism, if they're curious to know where this is, there's a Romanized version, and I imagine a Hellenized version that continues from the earlier Persian. Was it Iranian?
Indo-Iranian. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Iranian, really. Yeah.
Kind of like Yahwism, right? You have this Mithraism that continues, and it becomes a personal salvation cult for mostly Roman soldiers that were involved in that cult later. But thinking
absolutely. The Roman Empire could have gone in the 3rd century, could have gone either Mithra or Christianity. There was a point where it was either or, and I think the kind of the scales tilted towards Christianity because of the already existing weight of Yahwism in the empire.
This is so powerful. You're talking about forms of ancient, what we would define today, just using the term monotheism, is not what we think of post-enlightenment and all this stuff too. By the way, that is the problem with myth today, is that we're taught literal, this happened, Jesus did this, he walked on the water, he did that, and we're told these fantastic things. We have to swallow those pills as if they actually happened. The bubble pops, they didn't happen. This is part of literature. It's what you do. Now what? Well, it's all a lie and it's all BS, and you get the antagonistic chip on his shoulder atheist, like I initially may have started out in many ways. Right. Now I just love mythology, and I love the history and learning this stuff. But then going back to your point about like aniconism, the idea of not having images and icons which you point out Iranian or Persian ideas are there. We know Greeks who talk about this, making images. What's his name? The one we always talk about. He travels far and wide.
Herodotus?
Elephantine, I think it is, where he talks
Okay.
about forces. They draw, if forces
Yep.
could draw images of their gods, and it's really a slam on every human, every tribe, even animals would draw an image of the god. But the clear point is that the god is beyond the material images that we can say in anthropomorphic concepts
Yep.
of them. You could even go further back to the pharaoh Akhenaten, according to some of my Egyptologist friends.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. But also Herodotus says that the Persians were aniconic at certain periods. Again, things go back and forth, but in certain periods they were also aniconic, according to Herodotus. But it's interesting because Hecataeus also says that Moses introduced aniconism to the Jews. Okay, so if we're talking about that, then according to some of these sources, that was also introduced by Moses. If we go back to Moses, and so but clearly aniconism existed before that. Okay, before the 4th century, the 3rd century, early 3rd century BCE.
Or the idea that Moses taught the alphabet to the Phoenicians,
That's right.
who then later teach the Jews or Israelites.
That's right. Or the Greeks,
or the Greeks, and then that tradition of the idea of aniconism and no icon is, Greeks are actually being influenced by Iranian Persian thought.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, and they're not ashamed to credit where they found their ideas here in this context. So there's a lot of inner dialogue going on, and I want to break down those barriers and walls personally that I've been hearing amongst our friends that are in the scholarly community of like, no, what are you talking about? We have this ancient pedigree, even in scholarship, critical scholarship. So
I know.
I guess we're going so far because there's so much more we could say. But I wanted to ask 2 questions, and anything you want to add to this, feel free to add. But the one question is scholarship in the circles you're seeing, or even in the broader circles, starting to change and realize that they got to get with it, or they're going to become extinct fossils amongst academics? And then 2 is, are there other academics who agree with your assessment on Moses being dated this late, and the Exoduses and Moses shouldn't predate the 4th century BCE in your view?
Well, I mean, we're a minority, a small minority in scholarship. Most scholars, I mean, kind of today, the kind of standard view is that the Pentateuch was compiled and reached its more or less final form in the 4th century BCE under Persian rule. And there's the idea of a Reichsautorisation in German, or the imperial authorization that the Jews received to write down and to promulgate and to promote the Pentateuch. But there's absolutely no data to support this at all anywhere, even within the Bible, but also externally to the Bible. There's simply no, and in fact, as a scholar of the Achaemenid Empire, I have articles that have nothing to do with Judaism, only on the history of the Achaemenid Empire. So I'm actually a scholar of the Achaemenids. This would not fit the character of the Achaemenid Empire. They don't care. They wouldn't care about authorizing any people to write an authoritative cultic book. That's not part of that. That wouldn't even register with the Achaemenids. It's not something that they would do. And so the idea of this imperial authorization, or Reichsautorisation, simply has nothing to stand on. It is it solves a lot of problems. Because we scholars have started to notice that it cannot be before the Persian period. Big parts of the Pentateuch. So it solves a lot of conceptual problems. Simply, there's no data to support it at all, even in the Bible. And so that does not stand at all. So I think that, however, the book that I'm talking about, the Library of Alexandria, as a trigger for the writing of the Bible, that is supported by archaeology. It's supported by the onomastics. It's supported by Hellenistic sources. It's supported by so much that these other theories don't. And again, we have thousands of documents without any hint of any familiarity with the Bible. So I think in this generation now of scholarship, we are. What I'm trying to do, I can only talk about myself, but we are trying to move to a more scientific approach, a more based on actual data and not just within the Bible. Because if you stay within the Bible, you get to circular logic. There has to be some data outside the Bible to support. And again, you need to look at a lot of different types of data, archaeology, but also the Hellenistic sources, onomastics, epigraphy. All of these things need to be considered. A project that I'm involved in, a massive project that I'm involved with now, is trying to build the discipline and with partners in Germany and in different places, and it's a very ambitious project, but we are trying to rebuild the discipline of history, of ancient historical studies on science, really as almost as an exact science. So we have kind of a pipeline or an assembly line approach to this, where we take all of the visual data from an ancient object and we process this to different algorithms, AI-driven algorithms of all types. I mean, it's a very, very ambitious project. Ultimately, to create an absolutely objective assessment of that source in its historical context. But with absolute transparency, everything is transparent. There is no room for bias. I mean, there's always bias, even in AI. But I'm saying there is no room for personal bias. And even if there is bias, because of the AI, at least it's traceable. You can see it because of the transparency, you can trace it. So the idea is to create this. Again, it's a very ambitious project that we're now seeking a lot of funding for. But I'm optimistic that we will receive funding for this. But the idea is to really, for the first time, and again, we're a group of people doing this, but for the first time, we will be able to have this assembly line for historical studies, really a lab, like you would have in the exact science. And like in the exact science, our mathematics is philology. It's grammar, syntax, things like that. That has formula. Okay, just like with mathematics. So we're doing philology in a very, very precise way, and again, very transparent. Everything is traced. Everything is logged. Everything is explained. Even the errors that we make are explained and logged and everything, so we can learn from them. So it's a completely revolutionized. It's a revolution in historical studies. That is what we're trying to do.
Yeah. That's why my question, I like to see what consensus says on things, but consensus be damned if the evidence points in a direction that just isn't in that way. And that's why I asked it, because I know the consensus plays a part in a lot of people's minds. But the other question I wanted to ask was that, are there anyone else who's persuaded that of this idea that Moses is no earlier than 4th century BCE? And
we mentioned Russell Gumerican, we mentioned Jonathan Adler and others. Absolutely. Reinhard Kratz, also from Göttingen University, is. I wouldn't want to put words in his mouth specifically about Moses, but he's also in that. I haven't talked to him about Moses specifically, but he might be. But I know he's very much on board with us on all of these, on most of these questions. So we have people, and there might be people that are, doing this without me knowing about this in parallel. But this generation is really trying to make things more scientific, more objective, more transparent, more traceable. I mean, even in epigraphy. So historical studies, the historical field, the historical discipline is based on epigraphy. That's our raw data. Right. I mean, it's the materiality of the ancient sources and the text that is on them, but because they come from antiquity in real time, they were written by the simple people that sat in in Mesopotamia or Egypt or Greece or whatever, and we look at these texts with all of the complexities of this text, and then we can learn from it and reach conclusions. So epigraphy is really the blood of historical studies. Now, unfortunately, over the past century and a half or so of epigraphical work, there have been a lot of errors that were done. The field was still developing, and much of it was done with hand sketches. So they would sketch the object and the text on it, and of course you always get errors. But when you have a human having to sketch it, errors will inevitably creep in. So what we're trying to do is reimagine that. Also have epigraphy. That's part of this massive project that I mentioned. Also, epigraphy is done in a completely transparent way. My articles in epigraphy, when I republish or publish an ancient document, it's a very different approach if you compare that to other publications of epigraphic work. Because in my publications, you have dozens, if not several dozens of images, even microscopic images of each word independently, and I really analyze it to the extent that I have. I'm not saying that I'm free of error either, but at least I'm transparent, and you can find the error more quickly. And you can find my errors better, and that's fine. That's how science progresses. So yeah, we are in a kind of a new school of thought today, and it's exciting.
I'm excited. I really am. Everyone needs to go check out your article, and your book is out in open public access. They can download it. It will be in the description, which is covering much of this expertise you've been discussing today, but we've gone into rabbit trails outside of that book. But there's things we didn't discuss that are clearly documented in it. So get you a copy. Is there any recommendations you would ask people to check out, follow, subscribe, or read of yours that you would recommend?
So my academia page basically has the articles and the book, now this book is an edited book that I edited together with Professor Reinhard Kratz from Göttingen University. Great scholar, absolutely fantastic. It's edited. It has an article of mine and an article of Professor Kratz as well, but it has many other scholars or several other scholars. We have 19 altogether that are really cutting edge. So you can, if you download, and again, it's free. It's open access. You can download it, and as you said, you'll have a link in the comments, and so you can download it, and you have really the cutting edge, the leading scholars today, each contributing to different aspects of Yahwism in the Achaemenid period. It does not talk about Moses. It does not talk about Alexandria. It does not talk about really most of the stuff we talked about today directly. It really focuses on the period prior to that. The current book one of the books I'm working on, because I'm working on several, but one of the books I'm working on is this Alexandria library and its impact, which we covered pretty much today. Just the academia page and this book.
Stay tuned. Gad Barnea, thank you so much for your time. It's been quite insightful. It's a very challenging perception to try and do, but I think there's so much more to explore with this idea that we discussed today, and there is way more. We got to get into Yahwism, I imagine. I want to hear from you in the comments. Everyone who viewed, favorite part. What did you like the most? What was shocking, if there was anything shocking, anything interesting? Would you like to see something further elaborated in depth with Dr. Barnea? I would love to hear what you have to say. And check out the description. You can support us, join our Patreon, go get his book, check out his article, follow him on academia. All the things in order to enter heaven. Because if you don't, it's works-based salvation here, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you so much. We love you. And never forget, we are Myth Vision.